Welcome. Thank you for coming. My name is Craig, and I'm trying to reduce suffering in product development. I like to start with a bad joke, and because we're drinking and it's informal, it'll be an especially bad joke. So, a man walks into a bar, goes up to the bartender and orders a triple shot of whiskey, and gets it, and then the bartender says, that'll be, I don't know, 15 euros. Cheap whiskey? Maybe. And the guy says to the bartender, oh, I'm not going to pay you. Oh, why is that? Said the bartender. Because we're going to make so much money tonight together. How's that? Because the guy says, I've got something that's going to bring in so many crowds to the bar. And he has his backpack with him. And he pulls out of this backpack this little miniature piano. And then he pulls out of his backpack a little man this tall who sits down at the piano and starts playing wonderful jazz piano music. Well, the Twitter sphere explodes. So many people come in, they make tons of money. Finally, it's time for the bar to close. Everyone's gone except for the guy, the bartender, and the little guy there. And the bartender says, well, where did you get this? And the guy says, well, I found a magic lamp. And I rubbed it, genie came out. I asked for a wish, and here we go. Well, the bartender says, wow, that's amazing. Do you think I could try? Yeah, says the guy. So he pulls the magic lamp out of his backpack and gives it to the bartender. Poof. Master, your wish is my command. And then the bartender says, oh, I've always wanted $1 million. No problem, says the genie. Disappears. Then the door to the bar magically opens. And coming into the bar on the ground is a little duck. Quack, quack. And then another duck. And then the ducks, they start flooding in. Ducks and ducks and ducks. And there's ducks up to the knees, ducks up to the waist, and they're like up to their, chests and ducks as the ducks flood in. And the bartender says to the guy, hey, what's wrong with your genie? Is he hard of hearing? I didn't ask for $1 million ducks, I asked for $1 million. And the guy says, yeah, I found out he's hard of hearing. I mean, look at this little guy here playing the piano. Do you think I would actually ask for a 12-inch pianist? Downhill from there. So I'm going to share some ideas for around 30 to maybe 45 minutes, and then we'll do a structured question and answer as well. And also, just by way of preface, I've been coming here to Copenhagen for around 25 years now, sharing ideas, and it's always such a pleasure to meet with people who are interested in learning new things, and I'm happy to help any way I can. So after the formal discussion, if you have any questions, you're most welcome to come and happy to chat. Org design for large-scale adaptive product development. So just breaking down the title, org design for large-scale product development. The first thing that I'd like to emphasize is that what we're suggesting is not a new process, not a new method, not a new way of working, but rather what we're talking about is organizational design. And organizational design, if you're familiar with the Galbraith star model, which is a classic structure for talking about org design. Org design involves major elements, structure, such as teams, departments, processes, policies, people, their roles and paths, reward systems, etc. And as these lines suggest here, these lines here, everything is connected to everything else. It's a system. And to think that you can just change, for example, one part of the system is a fool's errand. And so, for example, a very common misunderstanding is to incorrectly say Scrum is a process. And by that incorrect misunderstanding, the group might think that all that they need to change for success are the ways of working. When in fact, if you understand deeply the implications of something like LeSS or large-scale Scrum, this has implications for the structure of teams, the career paths of people, the reward systems that are associated with it. And if not all of these things are actually put in place, you won't actually get the benefit that you hoped to get. It's a system. This is also not just about language for its own sake. The correct choice of language, org design versus process, is important for how senior management understands their responsibility. For example, if you were to go to senior management and say to them, we want to adopt a new way of working, take something simple like test-driven development. Well, if you said that to the CEO, she would probably say, well, that's great. How can I support that? She might say, it's not my job to learn about TDD, but I'm happy to help provide money and resources so that you can do this. Perfectly reasonable response. So in that context, if you have framed the change idea as merely a new way of working or a new process or a new operating model, then to summarize, the senior management would think that their responsibility is not to themselves become the experts in it, not for themselves to lead it, but rather in just some way to support. And that's a disaster if we're talking about something which is actually an organizational design. Because if you've studied management, you probably know that it's the remit of management to understand and create the organizational design. Org design isn't something that's done bottom up. Org design must be something that's done top down because it involves the definition of group structures, team structures, policies, reward systems, strategy, and everything. And so on the other hand, if one said to the senior management, we want to introduce a change idea, which is a deep organizational redesign. If you were to classify it that way, then if the senior management was educated in management, then they would appreciate and immediately recognize, oh, that's our responsibility because org design is the responsibility of senior management. And then they would ideally, hopefully say, and since we're talking about a deep organizational redesign, we, the C-level, are going to have to be intimately involved in learning every aspect of it, creating the solution, and leading the solution ourselves. That would be normal, skillful management when we're talking about changing an organization design. And so I'm hoping you can see that the implication of the terminology is important. On the one hand, it helps us appreciate that it's much more than a little part such as processes. It's a systemic change. And in addition, it has implication on how the senior management will engage or disengage. And that will take you to a path of potentially successful change or not. I'm breaking down the title. So we first looked at org design, and next look at large scale. Yeah. So what do I mean by large scale? I simply mean two or more teams working together on one project. And the key idea that we are suggesting in the LeSS community is the way to scale is by descaling, by which we mean to simplify an organization so that more teams can work together on one product. What often happens is that you have a traditional organization with component teams and single function teams, architecture teams, human interaction design teams, business analysis teams, testing teams, and then component teams and project management. And you have all of this complicated organizational design. And then what organizations usually do is that they ask the question, how can we smear Scrum and Agile paste on top of this existing complicated organization and make it be Agile? Instead of a very different question, which is, why is the organization complicated like that? And is it an intrinsic complexity, or is it a self-inflicted wound? Is it really a complexity itself created by the organization? And we're suggesting the latter. And that the way out of this ball of mud is not to try to enable the complexity, but by deconstructing the complexity, by simplifying the organization. So Bas Voda, my friend and the co-creator of LeSS and co-author, Bas and I, when we're speaking together, we might say something like, we want to scale development by descaling the organization. We want to be able to allow multiple teams to work together in one product in a simple way without the organization complexity getting in the way by removing that organization. The third term in the title is adaptive. Now, a little bit of historical background. In September of the year 2000, I got an email from a colleague, a guy named Bob Martin, also known as Uncle Bob in the community. And through the late 90s, up until that time, September of the year 2000, a number of us had been involved in coaching in XP and Scrum, etc., adaptive software development. And we wanted to grow the market. And Bob, an entrepreneur, owner of a small consulting company, was an enthusiastic coach and proponent of XP, of extreme programming. And in the email that Bob sent in September 2000 to me and to Martin Fowler, Kent Beck, Alistair Coburn, Bob suggested we should get together because I want to kind of paraphrase Bob's motivation. I want to grow the market. I want to be able to grow my business. And if we different folks in this community, which at the time was called the lightweight methods community, in order to grow this community, Bob's motivation was that we should get together and try to solve a couple of problems, such as having a name, because there was no appellation, there was no standard umbrella term for these family of approaches, such as DSDM and XP and so on and so forth. And also, another part of the motivation was that us different entrepreneurs and coaches and so forth could create some alignment around common marketing messages. And so it was agreed to get together in Snowbird, Utah in February 2001. And so one of the agenda items at that workshop was name. Now, at the time, in 2001, arguably the big dog in this market was Jim Highsmith. You might not have even heard of him, but he was actually the leading thought leader at the time in this area. His book, Adaptive Software Development, which came out in 1999, was hugely influential. It won various awards, widely read and popular. And so Jim was very influential in promoting this idea of adaptive software development, and which was also the name of his book. And so at the workshop, there's this activity to brainstorm the ideas for names. And because Jim was there and Jim was the founder of adaptive software development, not surprising, the name adaptive got on the voting list. Now, another person there was Mike Beadle. And Mike was the co-author of the first book on Scrum with Ken. And Mike had just recently finished reading a book called Agile Competitors and Virtual Organizations, which came out in 1994. And because Mike had read that book recently, the word agile came to his mind as a synonym of Jim's word adaptive. And so those were two of the words that were considered to describe this family of approaches. Notice that none of these words that were chosen or considered, none of the words meant fast, slow, or efficient, or incremental. And really, I want to focus on the fast to start with, because I've come to see that many people in the adaptive community have forgotten or lost the plot, that the purpose of these approaches is not to deliver fast. And if you want to quickly identify a so-called agile coach who doesn't understand the subject, you can quickly identify them if they incorrectly say that the purpose of these approaches is to deliver fast. That was not the purpose. If fast was the purpose, then the group would have chosen a name to be a synonym of fast, like quick time to market. But that wasn't the idea that the group was trying to communicate. Instead, what the group was trying to communicate was, if I could put it in a nutshell, the scientific method in product development. Now, the scientific method is based upon, I would say, intellectual humility. The default stance in science, and we can all have this mindset, even if we don't work as professional scientists, we can all have the default stance that everything I believe is probably wrong, my goals are probably wrong, etc. And so the idea in science is that the hypotheses that we have are probably wrong. And if you've formally studied science and if you've learned how to do experiments, you might know that statistically, you try to test for the null hypothesis if you've ever done experiments. In other words, you assume that the hypothesis will fail. And in fact, you're trying to falsify the hypothesis in science. You're not trying to confirm the hypothesis, you're trying to falsify the hypothesis. So the mindset is, our ideas are probably wrong, and let's try to falsify them so that we get rid of our unskillful ideas. And so the loop of the scientific method is hypothesis, experiment to try to falsify, collect data, and then if you successfully falsify the idea, then generate new ideas, and then move to a new direction based upon the learning. And this is essentially the idea that the groups have been trying to communicate. And the foundation of this, as I said, is intellectual humility.
Yeah, you could argue that having that approach, that very systemized approach, will lead to the words that you have below: fast, better flow, efficient, incremental. If your hypothesis put in place actually to prove these things, then by having that approach, will eventually over time become better in those domains.
True. If I understand your point, you said if the hypothesis was to become faster, if that was your point. But the point that I want to make is that that isn't the idea in product development. In product development, our goals are not to go faster, typically. Our goals are to deliver a product with a set of features or to solve some problem for the customer. Like, suppose, for example, I work in self-driving cars. I work as a programmer, as some of you know. And suppose the goal in the self-driving car is to drive steadily on the lane on the highway. So that's what I mean by a hypothesis in the language. So in the language that I'm talking about, a hypothesis, to connect it to product development, what I mean is, what products do we have? What features do they have? What problems do they solve? And that's what I mean by hypothesis. And the idea in the scientific method applied to product development is, for example, you have some idea of some features that we're going to implement. And this mindset is the following. All the features that we're planning to do are probably wrong. That's the idea. The problems that we're going to try to solve for our customers are probably wrong. This is the intellectual humility that I'm talking about. Now, notice how rarely people talk this way in business. People typically talk with what's called optimism bias and confirmation bias. Like, I've been in lots of business planning meetings over the years, and I don't think I've ever heard the conversation focus around all of our plans are probably wrong and let's try to falsify them. No, I see a world of intellectual arrogance where the assumption with the business plans is they're probably right and we should try to do them. So this is the exact opposite mentality. And it was that opposite mentality which was meant to drive this adaptive and agile movement. And so the idea is, okay, we're going to make a product, we're going to deliver some software features. So we deliver the features, assuming they're probably wrong. We try to falsify that they're wanted. And we either succeed in falsifying that they're wanted because it turns out the customers didn't want them or they didn't solve the problem. And then that's great. By the way, that leads to a follow-up point that I'll get to, an important point I'll make in a moment. Or on the other hand, we deliver some features, we solve some problem, and we discover it actually really was what the customer wanted and they loved it. And then we confirmed rather than falsified the hypothesis. The key point here, and this is the common pattern of software development, if you step back and look at most software products, is most software products have shitty features that people don't want. And so when you step back and look at the history of this, then it becomes a journey of trying to falsify our feature ideas for our products. Now, to come back to the point that I just made about doing some features, falsifying them, that in fact the customer didn't want them, or we tried to solve a problem that the customer didn't want. Falsify that, we discover not what we wanted, and now here's the key point. We stop that path, and we move on a new path based upon that learning. This implies changing direction rather than following a prior plan. Notice, by the way, how inconsistent projects are with this idea. Because the idea of a project is that we know what should be done, you fund the project, and then you execute the project. That idea is the opposite of the agile and adaptive idea. In the adaptive mindset, every project we're thinking about doing is almost certainly wrong and we shouldn't do it. And when you start the project, you would try to quickly falsify the project and stop doing it as fast as possible. That's the adaptive agile mindset. And that means, as a result, to repeat, that then we need to switch direction and do something unanticipated that we didn't consider before. And this is why the group was considering names like adaptive and agile. For example, if you read Martin Fowler's blog post about the Snowbird meeting afterwards, I'm paraphrasing, but he said something like, we chose the word agile because it expressed, and used the word adaptiveness, because it expressed the adaptiveness and need to respond to change that we felt was so important. That's a summary quote of the mindset of the people that were at this meeting. It was not about flow. It was not about delivering fast. It was about responding to change and moving in a new direction. And that implies that we want a low effort to change direction and a low cost to change direction. And that's why the word agile or alternatively adaptive was chosen. By the way, as an aside, I suggest, I'm not a language lawyer, I don't really care, but consider the idea of stopping using the word agile. Why? Because I observe, and I could be wrong, but it seems to me that so many organizations have lost the plot on this. And in 2022, it seems to me that agile means whatever a consulting company needs it to mean in order to win a contract with a customer. Oh, you need to do your projects predictably and on time and efficiently. That's what agile is for. Blah, blah, blah. This is completely nonsense. This has nothing to do with the idea that was being suggested in the original. And so as you might notice, I'll often instead use the word adaptive, which was a synonym and in fact was another word on the list of candidates to be chosen. And I don't believe that by starting to use the word adaptive, it will really make a significant difference, but it would at least open a conversation. Hey, why are you using that word? What does that mean? And then maybe we can reboot the conversation that this is not about flow, this is not about fast, this is about changing direction cheaply with intellectual humility, assuming that everything that we're doing is usually wrong. In other words, lost the plot. Now, what does it mean to be adaptive? And I'm not sure that everyone's thought through this in a way that you can measure and quantify this. So I'm going to try to break this down. I might do it poorly, but I'll try. For example, I know you're all quite young, so you might not know this, but back in the 1970s, when I started working as a developer, we used to do this old-fashioned technique called manual testing. I kid you not. There would be a human that would interact with a computer. They would interact with the keyboard to test the software. Insane, but that's what we used to do back in the 70s. Very inefficient and error-prone. But so let's imagine it's the 1970s, and you've got this old-fashioned organization that's doing manual testing at the end of some release cycle. And let's say I add up the person hours to do the manual testing, and I turn it into a cost, and let's say it turns into 50,000 euros of cost. Then, so every time you want to do a software release, 50,000 euros of cost to do the manual testing. This, by the way, is an example of what's called transaction costs. The transaction costs in English are the overhead process costs associated with a process cycle. So in one release cycle, the transaction costs of manual testing are 50,000 euros. I go to the CFO of the company and I say to her, every time we do a cycle of software release, there's 50,000 euros of manual testing cost back. And then I say to her, I ask her, how many cycles should we do a year? 1 or 20? What is she going to say? 1, right? Because in her mind, she's thinking, well, I don't want to multiply that transaction cost by 20 times. And if you've read really the first book that really kicked off this movement, Extreme Programming Explained by Kent Beck, if XP hadn't happened, if Kent hadn't happened, we probably wouldn't be here today. Because if you remember back in the 90s, XP is what exploded this whole movement open. So anyways, if you've read Kent Beck's original XP Explained book, he explores this very point, that if we want to have an adaptive organization, by the way, what was the subtitle of Kent's book? Was the subtitle Deliver Fast? What was the subtitle of this so influential book?
Chronic change.
Embrace change. Again, the emphasis that we were all trying to communicate is this is not about flow, not about fast. It's about changing direction based upon learning. Embrace change.
And Kent made the point that if an organization wants to be able to change direction and have multiple loops, we need to drive the transaction costs down to close to zero, because otherwise it'll drive people crazy. It'll be a lot of money spent, a lot of friction, a lot of pain and suffering. And so, rhetorical question, how do you measure adaptiveness? Well, one aspect, one element is your transaction costs. And if your transaction costs are high, that's going to create an inhibition, which will make it very hard to have a system in which you're shifting direction frequently in short cycle. But that's not enough to just have, for example, automated test and continuous integration with almost no cost. Let's imagine that these steps represent delivery cycles, like sprints, for example. But notice that I'm just walking in the same direction. So imagine in each of these cycles, I've got very low cost, very low transaction cost to deliver. But what am I doing? I'm going in the same direction. This is like delivering a project. And the adaptive movement was not to efficiently deliver projects, not at all. The adaptive movement is not for working your way down through a list. The adaptive movement was for the idea of we do a sprint, we deliver, we discover we were wrong, we throw away all of our ideas of what we had, and we start over and go in a new direction. And I recognize I've exaggerated that on purpose to make it more memorable, but that's the idea. We're not trying to conform to a prior project or list or goals. And so instead, what we should be doing is we take a step cheaply, we measure the impact. Like, for example, I've just been recently working in healthcare, and we might have software in a hospital where we're trying to deliver some new features which reduce patient onboarding time. And patient onboarding errors. Maybe we want the time to go down by 50% and the errors to go down 50%. So we deliver that hypothesis, we measure the impact, we discover it didn't make it go down 50%. And so what we should do is stop doing what we thought we should be doing. And we should press delete and then come up with new ideas every sprint, not projects, but new ideas every sprint, and switch direction to a new direction that we didn't consider before, and then do another sprint in an unanticipated direction. This is the idea. We're not trying to implement a list of features. We're learning and discovering where to go based upon learning loops and feedback. And now we get to the second point, which is switching costs, which is different than transaction costs. The switching cost, standard term in English process terminology, means the cost of switching direction. And in a software group, that would mean, number one, the costs of winding down all of the work in process work. And there's going to be a bunch of wind down activities. And then wind up activities. So you say to the group, do ABC. They're all learning about and preparing and delivering ABC. They do that. They're expecting to do DEF afterwards, but you say to them after ABC, everything that we were doing is wrong. We're going to stop that and do something completely different that we hadn't thought of before. And then, you can start the clock and measure how long it takes for that group to wind down everything and to start to move in a new direction and then to deliver. That's the switching cost. In short, adaptiveness means that you have low transaction costs plus low switching costs. And if you've never wondered how to measure adaptiveness, that's how you measure it. I'll also mention, as I make the point here, I observed that most books and courses and online material in the adaptive world has been focused on reducing transaction costs, like continuous integration, automated test, etc. And those are great things.
But you don't actually become adaptive until you also have driven down the switching costs close to zero. And I observe that there's very little education on this critical second part of what's necessary to become an adaptive organization. And this leads to the rhetorical question, well, what is it that creates the switching costs and how can we change those? And you'll have to come to my talk next year to learn the answer to that. Let's look at some organizational design elements and the relationship to transaction costs and switching costs. One possible org design element are called component teams. And I bet many of you know what this means, but to be clear, component teams are when you've got programmers attached to different pieces of code. For example, you might have something called the front-end team and they work on front-end code. The back-end team and back-end code. Or some shared services team and they work on the shared services code. Or a microservices team and then a team that works on a microservice. Anytime you've got teams attached to code, you have what's called component teams. And some of the language that you'll hear when there's component teams will be language such as our code, your code. We need to ask the front-end team to change their code. Also, if you work as a programmer and you're familiar, for example, with Git, you'll often see in organizations with component teams, you'll see separate repositories for each of the component teams. There's repo 1 for the front-end group. There's repo 2 for the back-end group, and on and on and on. And in fact, in large organizations, like maybe a bank, heck, there could be 100 or 500 component teams, then with 100 or 500 separate repositories. And some of the language of this is, if you hear of a front-end team, a database team, an analytics team, a reporting team, a microservices team, a library team, an application team, an Android team, all of those are synonyms of component team. So what? Well, let's look at the implication, for example, of having component teams, and then consider that org design for adaptiveness. So let's start with a customer requirement F1. Now, we're going to assume in this analysis that there are component teams. If there are component teams, front-end, middleware, back-end, service 3, microservice 4, and on, rhetorical question, who is going to do the business analysis? Which component team should do the business analysis and the user experience analysis? Should the back-end COBOL team do the business analysis and UX? Should the middleware, message-oriented middleware team do the business analysis? Why would they do that? Should the database design team do the UX analysis? Why would they do that? Seems strange. So if we have component teams, it begs the question of who's going to do the analysis. And so what do? We create a group called analysts to solve this problem. But I want you to just pause and notice that the reason why we created this separate group called analysts was because you had component teams. The fact that you had that as a previous constraint gave birth to the apparent need for this separate group called the analysts. Let's
let's add a group there and call them the analysts. Okay. Now, after the analysis, and notice, by the way, they will almost certainly create some kind of a document. Another question is, what about the human interaction design, the external design of the interface and so on, graphical interface, etc. Who's going to do that if there's component teams? Should it be the COBOL team that does the user interface? Why would the COBOL team do that? That seems strange. And so if we have component teams, that will give birth to the idea having another group. And some kind of transfer of documentation to that group. And this group you might call the designers. Next problem. There's multiple components involved. For example, front end, other component, that component, and doing F1 might involve cutting across all of these components to do it end to end. And so a question comes up is, it'd be nice to have a cohesive end-to-end design across all of these components. Question, who's going to do the end-to-end design? Will it be the back-end team? Why would they do the end-to-end design? Will it be the JavaScript team? Why would they do it? It's not clear. And so if we have component teams, then because of this problem, the usual solution is to make another team instead. And so do that. And once again, some handoff that way. And this group are usually called architects, or I often work in hardware and software products. And in the hardware software world, these folks are sometimes called systems engineers. And they'll create some kind of a document that describes some kind of a design across the component. Okay, let's move on. Let's imagine now that we're at the point where the component teams can create code related to F1. To add them to the picture. And well, let's have 3 of them. Now, a rhetorical question. Can we give these documents to the component teams? Maybe, but bear in mind that these documents describe the whole end-to-end solution. They don't actually describe the task for one component team. And so it's quite common as a result to actually introduce another role to solve this problem. That role. And this person, I've seen many names for this kind of role, often names which suggest that there's something funny, weird going on, like technical business analyst. I mean, what does that even mean? But I've seen names like that. Or business systems analyst. It's another one I've seen. What the heck does that mean? It somehow suggests this boundary between the business world and the technical world. And they'll take these artifacts And they need to create a customized document for a particular team. Let's copy one of these. And so they'll make a document and give it to that team. By the way, if you ask this component team here, you ask this component team, hey component team, what's that? You know what they'll say? Oh, that's a customer requirement. They've lost the plot because they can't see the whole. And those groups will create code. Now, notice that the code is not all integrated together in the way I visualized this. I've got the code separated. Why is that? On the other hand, if I were just to have drawn the word code once with the lines coming in, that would visually suggest incorrectly that all the code is being created together and being integrated together. But that's not what's happening, which is why I've drawn it this other way. Why? Why is the code actually separate? Well, there's several reasons for this. One is that imagine it's November 1 and you go to the different teams and you ask, what are they doing? Rhetorical question, how likely is it that all three teams are working on their task for F1 on November 1? And the answer is it's not very likely. And the reason it's not very likely is that the organization isn't just working on F1, they're working on F1 to F100. That's what's actually going through the system. And so, in fact, there's all kinds of documents, all kinds of tasks. Point 1. Point 2. So on November 1, when we asked these three teams, are you all working on your parts of F1? The answer is that's not very likely. And the reason is that the different component teams will, because of different priorities, be working on different features. This component team here might be working on their task for F1. This component team here might be working on their task for F7. That's very likely. And by the way, even if they were both starting off, imagine both teams started off working on their tasks for F1 at the same time. Well, these two tasks are not both exactly 17 person hours. One team's task might be 17 person hours. The other team's task might be 200 person hours. And consequently, when the first team has finished their task, they're going to go on to a task for another different feature. And that means the work is done asynchronously. The different component teams will be working asynchronously on different parts of different features. And therefore, the code is not all being integrated together at the same time. Now, you might have heard of something called continuous integration. And I've learned that not everybody knows what continuous integration actually means. Continuous integration is an idea that was first promoted in XP by Kent Beck. And I had the good fortune to take one of the first courses with Ken back in, I think, 97 or so to start to become an XP coach. And so I'll try to share with you continuous integration, the definition from the person who popularized it, Kent. So many people find this surprising. Continuous integration actually means to integrate continuously. And I know that sounds crazy, crazy talk, but if I go to a typical company and I ask them, are you doing continuous integration? You know what they answer? They say, oh yes, we have a build system. And Build systems have nothing to do with continuous integration. Continuous integration is a behavior by developers. It's got nothing to do with a build system. It's the behavior of integrating continuously, to bringing all the code together. But because of the reasons I just explained, in this case, the code is not all being worked on together for the same features, and so it can't be integrated continuously. If it was, you'd get link failures or integration failures because not all of the pieces in the code are together. This is a side effect of having component teams. Well, next problem. So how do we bring all the code together? How do we get to this point? And back in the 1970s, when this problem started to emerge, there was a solution for it. People introduced a new role called release manager. And the purpose of the release manager would be to eventually bring all of this together and finally herd the cats and until the code was all brought together and then it was integrated and then you could release it. Moving on, notice that we have a lot of complexity here. The work of F1 has been chopped up between a lot of different groups. And so we have a coordination problem. How do we solve that? We need another role. Oh. So, got another role. In fact, probably need a bunch of these folks. And we need coordination managers. These are often called project managers, but what they're really doing in this context isn't necessarily related to a project. It's related to coordinating the work of everybody. And so to conclude, this is a pattern of what happens when you have component teams. First of all, notice that this is analysis, design, architecture, programming, and by the way, we're going to have to do testing at the end of this as well, which means that we're also going to have to add a testing group. I'm not even going to open up the complexity of that here. And so what does that look like? Analysis, design, programming, testing. What does that look like? The waterfall. Fact, if you have component teams, you will have a waterfall. And I've met some groups that say, oh, we're an agile organization. And I go inside and they've got component teams. So clearly the management doesn't even understand how their organization is working. Because when you think slowly and see this, you can see that if you have component teams, you must have a waterfall. The component teams give birth to a waterfall. Well, let's go back to the question of transaction costs and switching costs. So, do you think that this org design has a low transaction cost? No. Thought experiment. We introduce a bunch of features, we let it run for 6 months until stuff starts to come out the other end. And then we go to everybody and we say, oh, we're changing our ideas. Please wind down all the work you're currently working on, unless we're going to introduce brand new ideas that we didn't think about before. This is the switching cost. Do you think the switching cost is low in this model? Far, far away from being adaptive. We define adaptive as low switching cost, low transaction cost. This is far away from it. How about lead time, concept to cache time? You think this is associated with fast delivery? Not at all. All right. So we've just explored these questions. But one of the questions that we didn't explore that I also want to pick up now is this org design associated with high value? Let's examine this question of high value. Here's a list of features, and imagine they're organized by value, however we define that, 1 to number 15. And these are the components that are touched by feature 1. These are the components touched by feature 2, and so on. And because there's multiple components involved, we could ask and answer the question, what components are touched by what features? Now let's do a short thought experiment. Let's assume that the first feature that touches component 18 is feature 15. Second, let's assume that it's going to take 6 months for the group to start working on number 15. Their best estimate, at least 6 months before they can start working on number 15. Next in this thought experiment, it's day 1 of the story, so it's day 1 up here. And the CEO of the company comes to the development group on day 1, and she goes to the room where the C18 programmers work. She opens the door on day 1, and there's no C18 programmers. And so she then goes to a development manager and says, hey, where's the C18 program? And he says, we estimate that it's at least 6 months before we're going to start working on number 15, which is the first requirement that involves team C18. And therefore, he says, I've invited them to go on vacation for 6 months and then to check in and see if it's time to come and type the code for their part. So does the CEO go, wow, that's a great idea. Can't say I've ever seen that. Instead, what does the CEO say? She says on day 1, hey, I expect team C18 to be busy. So on day 1, what requirement does team C18 work on day 1? The answer is number 15. This is not an organization working on high value. This is an organization optimized for busyness, for output, but working on low value just to keep them busy. And so we can see just logically that this organizational design is not consistent with high adaptiveness, it's not consistent with low lead time, and it's not consistent with high value. I hope you can see that from a careful analysis. Now, the good news is here. Right. Right. Now, the good news is that this group, they go to a course on scaling agile. And when the management comes back, they figure out how to change the organization and go through a deep transformation to be scaling in an agile way. And here's the new deeply changed organizational design. So now, in the radically changed organizational design, they have product owners that create epics and agile designers that create design stories, and agile architects that create architectural evidence, and team product owners that create stories, and scrum teams that deliver code, and DevOps, and scrum masters. Now, previously, this organization was inconsistent with adaptiveness, low lead time, and high value. But after they make this deep change, if you ask the managers, what are they doing? They say, we're an agile organization that delivers fast with high value. And I hope you can see what an illusion and fantasy that is. And yet, you know, I've been doing this for decades. I see this everywhere. These just utterly fake changes without any insight on what's really going on. What's an alternative? An alternative, instead of component teams, are feature teams. In feature teams, we create a team of 7 or 10 people, where in that team, the people work across the entire code stack. So this, by the way, implies shared code rather than private code. It also will imply mono repo, going to a single repository. So like Google, if you don't know this, Google has one repository with billions of lines of code in it, mostly shared code, where more or less most programmers can change most code anywhere. So like the Google model, and with feature teams. And these feature teams are not teams of coders. These are teams of problem solvers. They're not software developers. Feature teams are product developers, where they're involved in the 3 major steps of development. The Finnish thought leader, Ari Tikka, talks about it as dreaming, thinking, doing. And if you think about what goes on in software-intensive product development, most everything can be covered under dreaming, thinking, doing. And in traditional organizations, the dreaming, the thinking, and the doing are separated into 3 different groups. The idea with real feature teams is that they're doing everything from dreaming to doing. In other words, analysis, user experience analysis, interviewing customers, measuring the impact, and so forth. And it's possible to show that feature teams are consistent with adaptiveness, low lead time, and working on high value. Notice also that if we move to feature teams, we're going to eliminate all the complexity that we see here. Sort of path to that picture. All of this complexity is eliminated if we move to feature team. And at the same time, it allows us to scale to have more teams working in a simple way on one product. This is the message that we're trying to suggest. This is why LeSS is called LeSS. It's conveniently an acronym for large-scale Scrum, but what we really mean by LeSS is simplification, a more adaptive organization with a less complicated organization, descaling. That concludes my overview of what I wanted to share formally. And now for the next 25 minutes, we're going to organize this as a structured Q&A. And the way I'm going to do this is I want you to get together in pairs. And in each pair, I want one person, or triplets, I want one person to play the role of scribe, and the scribe will write down questions. And the person, you'll talk with some partner or some triplet, hey, what questions do we want to ask? And the scribe will write them down. Then, after this activity, for which we'll spend 3 minutes,
Then in 3 minutes, we're going to come back together and I'll move us on to the next step in this structured Q&A process. So what you're going to do next is you're going to find a partner or a triplet, you're going to find a scribe, and you're going to spend 3 minutes generating questions for me. See you in 3 minutes. All right, now in the room are some scribes who have the question lists with them. And I'm looking for scribes with the lists that were born in the month of January. And I'm going to assign you awesome powers. You are the question owner, and you get to prioritize the question list. Please give me the first question you'd like to ask.
So I think I will take the second one from my list. The three of us are from an organization where we need many competencies, and our products are actually solutions consisting of many products, you can say. So we have algorithm people and acousticians and chip designers and embedded software and different types of PC software and apps and cloud and the solution consists of different apps and different PC softwares and doing it with chips inside that we made and so on.
Yeah.
And how do we create feature teams that not contain 35 people?
So just to test my understanding, and I think that question was probably picked up pretty clear because you were close enough to the mic, I'm guessing. Just to test my understanding, to do something end to end would currently involve like 20 or 30 different single specialists. Is that true?
In many cases, at least that, yeah.
Yeah. So this is a situation where I often recommend exploiting patterns to see where you can get some advantages, but you can't yet get to the perfection vision. You know, there's an old saying in French, so le meilleur est l'ennemi de bien. The best is the enemy of the good. And so the perfection vision is, of course, a feature team. But even if, for example, you could find sub areas where you could put together a semi-feature team that didn't solve the complete end-to-end stack, but might reduce the problem in half, then I encourage you to look for those. And you might want to look at the patterns of, you've got many requirements, and then there'll be patterns of what things are touched by different families of requirements. You understand my point? And you might see that for some common patterns of families, you can exploit that pattern to form groups that are kind of specialized around being able to work across that part of the stack, although they can't actually do everything end to end. And then you've made an incremental step towards this perfection vision, but not yet there at the final step. Kind of a variation of this is, imagine we took the entire stack of everything that you needed to do. And so to implement the solution, you've got to do everything that way. But for example, you might be able to say, okay, maybe we can start off by moving to teams that at least can work across this layer and this layer. So they start to become, let's call them multi-component teams. They're not yet feature teams, but they're extended to be able to work across more than one. And then this is taking you in the direction of truly adaptive teams. And you might be able in some years to go even further and then maybe even merge the first versions of the teams here into a second incarnation of the teams as they learn more of it. So in your case, I recommend this incremental step towards it rather than thinking you're going to get there, if that helps. Was there another January owner? February. Yes, please.
All right. We had a question regarding like this. How do you feature teams without casualties?
So the question was, how do you move component teams to feature teams without casualties? What's an example of a casualty?
I think we are talking about the role that would be content.
Oh, yeah. I think I understand. We suggest an idea called parallel organization. If you try to make, this is the generalizing point here. If you try to make a deep change in an existing traditional organization, good luck with that. Let me know how that goes. I've been involved in change for decades and decades, and I've never seen successful deep change inside of a big traditional organization. You might have heard of something called systems thinking, and there's something called the 11 laws of systems thinking. One of the laws is the harder you push, the harder the system pushes back. So if you try to fight the existing system, it's really a fool's errand, and you'll be doomed to casualties. And that casualty will probably be you, the change agent, more than the people who you were concerned about. So instead, we recommend an alternative approach, which is that you set up a parallel organization to your existing R&D organization. Number one. Two, the org design, the new org design with feature teams is only in the parallel organization, but not in the traditional organization. Next, you look for volunteers to join it, and a small number at a time, like 30 or 50 volunteers. And those volunteers from the traditional organization have learned everything about the new way of working, about feature teams, about becoming multi-skilled, and so on. And they're volunteering, wanting to do it, being fully informed of the implications. And if you do that, then number one, the people in the traditional organization are not threatened because you're not destabilizing their jobs. Number two, the volunteers that have moved to the new organization, they're happy because they volunteered to do that and they wanted to do this. So this reduces that kind of fear problem and casualty problem. Furthermore, it also creates an excellent compare, contrast opportunity. Because now, for example, you could measure lead time in the traditional organization versus the new one. You could measure adaptiveness, transaction cost and switching cost in the traditional organization versus the new one. You could measure the amount of high value delivery in the two, and then senior management has concrete data about which of these two organizations is more consistent with what they really want. And then they can go on an incremental, slow journey. So we recommend a kind of gentle volunteering approach in LeSS, if that helps. More February owners. March. Yes.
Question I'm going to pick from here is how to address the C level and talking on these
So the question was how to work with senior management or the C-level for a deep change, if I understood the question correctly. I don't know. I've heard this question for 40 years. I know, many people in the world of software change and so forth, and I've never once in my career seen anyone solve this problem, which is why you keep hearing this question decade after decade. As far as I can tell, there is not a solution. And I'll go a little bit deeper on this point. Dr. Cotter is a professor at Harvard Business School, and he's a researcher into organizational change. One of Dr. Cotter's books related to this question is called A Sense of Urgency. And what I've observed over my career, and what Cotter has observed in his research, is that unless there's a sense of urgency by the senior leadership Deep change will not happen. Now, what creates a sense of urgency could be an existential crisis. So for example, I've been working in autonomous vehicles for a while now, because this is an entire industry which is going to get disrupted by self-driving. And if all of the traditional companies, Ford, BMW, etc., if they can't figure out how to make a self-driving car seriously good, that can compete with what Tesla is doing and with what Waymo Google is doing. And by the way, as an aside, Waymo, Google, and Tesla are so far ahead of all of the other companies, it's just ridiculous. If these other companies can't do that, they know that they're in a very dangerous place and the companies don't have a future. So in this case, the board and the senior management of automotive are serious about deep change, and they want to change because they know it's not going to work the way that they're going. Most companies have too much money. They say they don't have too much money, but when you look at the amount of dysfunction, changed feature or fake change, and overhead waste, they clearly have too much money. That's why it's virtually impossible, I observe, to ever do successful change in financial services. Banks, trading, and so on. These are domains where the only thing that happens is fake change, because there's just way too much money. So good luck with that. Now, to go a little bit farther, I have a I have a 4-hour executive seminar called Systems Thinking and Org Design that I do with senior management, either the C-suite or C-1. And there are situations where you can't convince the senior management to do anything serious. They don't actually really have a sense of urgency, but you might see an opportunity at least to get them in a room for 4 hours. And if that can happen, then you might have a chance. And by the way, when you're working with C to C-2, it's very hard to get even half a day with them. Good luck on trying to get a full day with that. And so a half day is the most that I can ever manage with them. If you can do this, there's a chance you can move the needle on them. For example, maybe starting to think about a parallel organization, some kind of bounded experiment. And notice that a parallel organization is not, it's not a big cost, it's not a big risk. In other words, parallel organization is low cost and low risk. So it's not a very difficult ask. Try to set up a parallel organization with 30 or 50 people, and you might be able to get some traction that way. And again, with the compare and contrast, if you could get the parallel organization support for 50 people, then with the data from the compare and contrast, that could create a motivation for more of the same. March owners. Yes.
That's a good question already.
Any more? Right. April owners. May owners. Subtract 9 months and see what goes on here. It doesn't go on here. June. Yes. The question is the role of the line manager. So in LeSS, managers are optional. They may be present, but there's no necessary requirement for them. Because LeSS, like Scrum, is based upon self-managing teams. And if you have self-managing teams, you don't need a line manager. And if you think about the kinds of traditional things that line managers typically do, you think about this. why, what, how, somewhat related to dreaming, thinking, doing. In traditional organizations, line managers will often be involved in why and in what, and often in managing and directing the how. But in Scrum, and therefore in large-scale Scrum, who's involved in why? The product owner and the team. Who's involved in what? The product owner and the team. And who does the how? The team. So notice there's no role for line management in those activities. Another possible activity of line managers is, for example, team coaching. But you definitely don't want to do that in Scrum because that violates the Scrum model. Question, who is the coach to the people in the team in Scrum? The Scrum Master. The Scrum Master, read the Scrum Guide. The Scrum Master is officially the coach to the members of the team. And so to have another person like a line manager interfere and also coach the team members breaks the Scrum model. So you don't want that. So there's no role for line managers in coaching team members. So that goes away. What about hiring? Well, in good R&D 101, in almost every great company, the decision to do hiring is made by the engineers themselves, by the developers. Those are the people best skilled to decide whom to hire. So that doesn't require a line manager. What about discipline and firing? Well, first level discipline in terms of trying to work with some unskillful person in the team, the first step of trying to work with unskillful people in the team is the responsibility of the Scrum Master. So again, no line managers have anything to do with that. What if it's a serious problem, like John is stealing or John is a meth addict? Well, then a good group to handle that problem is HR or the people group. They're probably much more skilled and effective for serious personnel problems than a line manager would be. And they probably have education and resources related to John as a meth addict. So there's no role for a line manager to do that either. And consequently, that's why line managers are optional in this, because there's really nothing for them. Did that help answer the question?
Unrelated question to that one, so if there were line managers, who should take that role in your mind?
First of all, before answering that question, let me back up and answer what would they do if they exist? Because if you read the LeSS rules, we actually talk about that. And I'm paraphrasing LeSS rules, but basically it says the role of managers, if there are any, is to improve the organizational system. In other words, the role of managers has got nothing to do with the teams, nothing to do with the product owner, nothing to do with delivery. The role of managers is to improve the development system. I'll give you a concrete example. Years ago, I was working at a company in Germany. We were working on a self-driving car, and the prior state was that many of the people were in different cities and different buildings. We wanted to be in one building in one place. The manager got the land and made the building. That's what managers do in a LeSS organization. They improve the development system, but they've got nothing to do with the people. Notice that that kind of work, like making a new building, is a senior manager position. So the implication there is that if there are any managers in a LeSS organization, the very few that we need would be relatively senior managers. And I'm sorry, now I've forgotten what your question was.
If there were line managers who should take the role, like, for example, can it be like a one developer team or?
Who?
Who should take the role if there were line managers?
So who should take the role is typically someone existing already very senior. For example, most R&D organizations, every R&D organization currently has a manager called head of development. That person would be the line manager. And we recommend a ratio of 100 to 200 developers for each manager. This is standard advice from some of the Japanese quality people, like Shigeya Shingo. Shigeya Shingo in Japan used to always recommend at least 100 people for each line manager, because then it's very hard for them to actually interfere. Seriously, because remember, they should have nothing to do with any people. And so it should be 100 or 200 people to one line manager, because number one, it's an overhead role, so we don't want a lot of them. We don't want to spend a lot of salary on them. Number two, they shouldn't have anything to do with the teams, the people in teams. So you don't need very many of them. How many do you need to make a new building, et cetera? Just a few. So we like for maybe 500 developers, you might have a couple of. That was June, if I recall. And it's 7:30, and so sadly, it's time for us to. Thank you for your time.